Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages good discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now, your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. I'm Kevin Quinn. Our special guest today is Gary Kincaid, who is a wastewater engineer from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And if you're very observant, you'll notice that we're not in our usual studio today. We are actually outside on the campus of St. Norbert College in front of the beautiful Fox River, and that is the subject of our conversation today. Gary, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, tell us a little bit about your own involvement with the Fox River.
I'm a wastewater engineer for the Department of Natural Resources. I've been working in this area for 32 years. I'm a wastewater engineer who oversees Brown Door and Kewaunee County. I work with mostly municipal facilities and some major industrials like the paper mills. And so I've been involved in some fashion or another with wastewater and water quality issues on the Fox River for my entire career at the department.
Okay, and you're a Wisconsin native, I understand, right?
Yep, from Wisconsin, grew up in central Wisconsin, Port Edwards.
Port Edwards, went to Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and Marquette, if I'm not mistaken.
Stevens Point, Marquette, and Madison. Yeah.
And Madison, so you've made the whole circuit of the,
Yeah.
of the whole state.
Yeah.
Well, as a lot of folks might know about, the Fox River has a very interesting industrial history. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it is something that we would be concerned about today?
Well, the Fox Rivers, which the section we're talking about is from the discharge of Lake Winnebago out to the Bay of Green Bay, is one of the most heavily used industrial rivers in the country, maybe in the world, I think, is what I've heard in terms of the number of paper mills that are on the river. So it's a heavily worked river. There's a lot of municipal discharging facilities, municipal wastewater treatment plants, and then the paper mills that have roughly at their peak maybe were 17 or so paper mills that were discharging into the river at various stages along the river. So it's a heavily worked river, a lot of pollutant load, a lot of history with legacy kind of contaminants going into the system.
Right, and I think a lot of folks are aware of the PCBs, and right now there's a huge project which you're involved with as far as removing the PCBs from the riverbed. So talk to us a little bit about what the problem is and how you guys are going about taking care of it.
Well, for more than 20 years, plans were developed and studies were done, evaluations were completed on the presence of PCBs, the effect on the system, and remedial action possibilities, what we need to do about it. And in the end, they concluded that remedial action needed to be done to remove PCBs from the river, to remediate the PCBs in the river, either by removing them or capping them in place. And so ultimately a remedy was developed that included a combination of remedies, including mostly dredging, but also some capping of materials to keep them in place.
Okay, when you talk about dredging and capping, for those of us that aren't wastewater engineers, what do you mean by that?
Dredging in this project involves hydraulically dredging. It's like a vacuum cleaner underwater with an egg beater on the front of it that churns up the sediment and then hydraulically pumps it up to a processing facility. And so that's what we call dredging. And then capping and sand covering are other possible remedies, which include sand covering is when you have thin layers of low concentration sediment, low concentration of PCBs, you put a sand layer on it. It's more of a dilution layer. And capping is a combination of putting a sand layer on that kind of isolates the sediment, and then you put armor stone on top of it. So gravel or big rock as large as 3 to 6 inches or even larger depending on where you are in the river. This armor stone is put on top of the sand to keep the sand in place. The whole theory behind PCBs is they're not particularly mobile on their own. They don't dissolve into the water, but they do move with the sediment. So the goal is to keep the sediment in place, either remove the sediment completely or keep it in place where it is. And so you put this cap on place to permanently seal it in.
So PCBs, what are they? What does PCB stand for? And I guess why do we care about it? I mean, there's chemicals everywhere, right? Why are those particularly interesting and worthy of remediation?
Yeah, PCBs it's an organic compound, polychlorinated biphenyls. It's a long, fancy organic name, but it's a compound that was developed. It's a very stable compound. It's heat resistant, has a lot of good properties. It was an engineered organic compound that various manufacturers decided to use in various processes. The primary one that we're dealing with here on the river is it was used in the production of carbonless copy paper. And it was used in the emulsion sealing process where they encapsulated little seeds of ink on the back of paper, encapsulated the material, they coat it on the back of the paper, you write on the paper and it breaks through and create what's known as carbonless copy paper. You don't have the blue sheets of carbon paper anymore. So that process is where most of the PCBs in the river came from. PCBs were also used in grinding fluids, in electrical equipment, transformer oils, things like that. But there are places where there might have been releases in the river, but most of the PCBs in this system that we're remediating have come from the production of carbonless copy paper and then the subsequent recycling of that paper in recycle mills that are up and down the river.
And why would we be concerned about it? I mean, it sounds like it was a positive thing that the companies used in their processes.
Yeah, well, PCBs at the time they were developed weren't identified as being toxic, but as time went on and more analysis was done, they realized that PCBs have health effects both with fish and wildlife and humans. The health effects are that the fish that consume them bioaccumulate the PCBs, and so when people eat the fish, we get toxic doses of PCBs, and it's not acute in the sense that it causes you to get sick or feel ill for any reason. It's a long-term kind of buildup in the system where it causes developmental issues in children and health and reproductive issues in fish and wildlife. And so there are health effects in both the target, the fish-eating population, whether it be people or critters. And so I think in the case of PCBs, there's a lot of study, a lot of history involved in it. It's known as a potential carcinogen. It's not been proven as an absolute carcinogen, but it's believed to be carcinogenic. And so it's just a number of characteristics that make it, that prevent us from eating the fish in the system. And so it is the fish consumption advisory impact that it has that is the reason we're doing the project on the river. Is if it weren't for the fact that we couldn't eat the fish, it's not clear how far along we would be. That's the primary driver in the remediation effort and the need for remediation.
So right now you're not supposed to eat the fish that come out of the river, is that right?
Well, there are fish consumption advisories that are unique to each segment of the river and unique to each species, the size of the fish, I mean. So there's a whole booklet that identifies what you can and can't eat. Some fish you can, and every year, every few years, the department revises, along with the Health and Family Services, revises the consumption advisories based on monitoring data that they collect during those periods of time to see what the fish is trending, whether the concentrations are increasing or decreasing. And in general, we've been seeing them decrease.
Decreasing. Well, I don't think that's harming the sport fishing business here. When I look out my office window, I can see certain times of the year walleye fishermen almost elbow to elbow here trying to catch that great trophy.
Right.
And not very long ago, I think at the mouth of the river, what may be a world-class muskie was caught. I don't know if you saw that or not.
I did, yes.
There was one happy guy holding one big fish.
Right, and there's a lot of big fish in the system. It's a world-class fishery basically for walleyes. For muskies, they're a growing population. The department's done a lot of work in introducing and kind of trying to develop that fishery. It's very healthy for the system. There's a lot of forage fish in the river, and so there's a lot of food for the predator fish to eat, and it's a very positive story. Right now, most of the people who fish do catch and release, but our goal ultimately is that you don't have to do all the releasing, that you get to keep some of them to eat. And there are people who do eat them, which is ill-advised at this point for many of the fish, but in time we expect that to improve as this project progresses and as time goes on. We expect to see improvements or reduction in the fish consumption advisory limits.
Oh, one of the things that I've noticed just in the 20 or so years that I've been here is an increase in the bird populations around here. There are pelicans all over the place.
Yeah.
And if you've never gotten a chance to get up close and personal with a pelican, they're impressive animals. You guys must run into them all the time during your work on the river here.
Well, they certainly have increased in population a lot over the years, and it's pretty neat to see. And what a lot of people don't realize is the pelican was native to the area, disappeared for a while, and then came back. I've never heard a connection between the contaminant levels and why that happened, so I don't know if there is a connection to that. But they certainly have come back with a force of large numbers, and it's pretty neat to see because they're a huge bird and they're kind of magnificent seeing them flying around.
Yeah, if you get a chance to kind of float down the river here, it's mostly slow, no wake, closer to the mouth. You get a chance to see them, and they're pretty used to looking at boats, I think.
Yeah.
And so, of course, if I were that big, you know, I probably wouldn't be afraid of much either. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of work that you guys do. You do this dredging. How do you do it? I mean, is it on barges? Do you use divers? How do you go about it? What time of the year do you work? What's it like out there trying to get this job done?
Well, the construction season is basically from beginning of April through mid-November. When there's ice on the river, we don't work on the river, but the contractors hired to do the work use hydraulic dredges. There's great big barges out there with these big dredges with long swing arms on them that have a cutter head on them, and then hydraulically vacuum the sediment off the river bottom. They pump that sediment up to the processing facility where the water's squeezed out of the sediment. The sediment then goes off to stockpiling, then gets hauled off to a landfill down in Calumet County. The advanced disposal facility used to be Veolia Hickory Meadows facility. And then the water that's squeezed out goes through a pretty advanced wastewater treatment process where it runs through sand filtration, carbon adsorption, and then is discharged back into the river in a much cleaner state than it was pumped out of the river at. And so that process goes on again from April through November, or through mid-November, and kind of 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, weather permitting. There's sometimes, very, very seldom, but occasionally they have to shut down for a while if there's really inclement weather. But these dredges are pretty sturdy, and they're out in the river, and these guys are used to working in pretty severe conditions.
So it's the sand filtration and charcoal, that's kind of like my aquarium when I was a kid.
Right,
Had
yeah.
exactly that same
Exactly.
kind of thing. So you say the water that's going back into the river is cleaner than the stuff you're taking out?
Yeah, if you were to look at it and hold it up in a beaker, it pretty much looks like drinking water. It's very clear. It runs through a pretty advanced treatment system. In the treatment process, when they dewater it, they put it through settling basins. They add some chemistry to it, polymers to the water to help settle out the solids. Then those solids get sent to another process where they get squeezed out through these big machines called plate frame presses that looks like a big accordion, and they basically squeeze the water out of the sediment until you have a sediment that's about 60% solids, which to a normal person looks like regular soil, some nice organic soil. It's very black, organic-y looking material, and then that material gets hauled to a landfill for disposal.
So tell us a little bit about the scale of the project. How many people are working on it? What kind of, I mean, do you have barges out here all over the place, or how do you do this?
Well, anybody on the river knows that there's a lot of barges, a lot of pipelines, a lot of floating pipelines, and markers and buoys and signage on the river. And I'm not sure exactly how many. I'm thinking around 100 people working on the project, approximately, between the contractors, the consultants. It's a pretty big professional effort. This project is the largest in the country of this sort, so there's a lot of people all the way from the design engineers to the contractors implementing the plan, which includes the dredging people, the dewatering people, the people who haul the sediment to the landfill. So there's a pretty big group of folks all involved in either the removal or the transport and disposal of the material.
And that's jobs for Wisconsin. And
A lot of jobs.
And leaving the river better than it's found. So how long is this project going to go on for?
Well, the main body of work was done from 2004, and it will finish in about 2017, 18, depending on projections. But so a long time.
Job security.
Job security.
Well, let's talk a little bit more broadly about the river. Tell us about the river, what it is, why is it here? And there's a lock system, et cetera. What was it like before the European settlers came here and put on the lock system, and what has it been used for over the years?
Well, I'm not a real good historian, and it was a little before my time, but it was, rivers back in the day were the source of, was the routes of economy. If you're on a river, that's where the economy happened. And so this system had a lot of history of logging, timber, forest products kind of work. Ultimately then became very heavily worked for the paper industry because of the source of timber and the water which they needed to do the process. That was most of what I understand. Fishing out on the bay and in the river, a lot of industry around that, but most of it was either timber and or paper manufacturing.
And shipping, of course, too. I mean, the Green Bay is still a very active port. So if you've ever sat and watched, and on a summer day, you'll very often see a giant barge or a ship come in and drop off coal or whatever. Do they have to dodge you folks as they come through? Or are you not allowed to work in certain spots? Or
well, we coordinate, or I should say I don't directly, but the company doing the dredging has to coordinate with the shippers. And so when a ship's coming into a particular spot, they'll arrange and make contact with those guys to make sure that the dredging operations are not in the way. Because we don't do anything that inhibits the dredging at all. They just have to try to work around the boats that are coming and going. And so, the farthest upriver that they come would be the Georgia Pacific facility and the coal deliveries that they receive. And most of the other work is further downriver, where we're not in that section of the river. When we get down there, it's going to be a little bit more of a dance to try to coordinate that, because the river's narrower, there's more traffic there. But between coal, there's cement. Those are the two primary reasons that ships are coming into the area. More recently, there's been some more petroleum products further up near the mouth of the river.
so did you start all the way in Appleton and are working your way back? Is that
right? We're trying to do an upstream. Upstream is all the way up at the outlet of Lake Winnebago, all the way downstream to the mouth and out into the bay a little bit. And so we're trying to work upstream to downstream so that you're not recontaminating what you're doing. Once you're done upstream, you don't want to be doing work. If you were to start the work downstream, you'd recontaminate it by some of the work that you do, because as you're doing the cleanup, there's a little bit of resuspension, it moves a little bit, and so working upstream to downstream is the most effective way at doing the work.
So are you doing the whole bottom of the river, or are you just picking out certain hot spots that...
They've done a very intensive effort to characterize the sediments in the river, where they have a sample every couple of acres, and then through modeling and analysis they decide where the contaminants are located and what remedy is appropriate for that area. So the remedies would include either dredging it all, partially dredging and then capping it, or sand covering it if it's lower concentrations.
And so this will be done in a few years, and will people be able to swim in the river, drink the water?
Well, the rivers aren't generally good for drinking water because there's enough of a sediment load, so I don't ever see it as a drinking water source. The bay could be, or Lake Michigan certainly is, but I wouldn't see the river as a drinking water source. But certainly there are a lot of people who swim and recreate in it now. We don't see that there's any reason not to do that. There are other things going on in the river unrelated to the PCBs that have more to do with desire to swim and recreate in the river, just because of the algae blooms and the nutrients that are in the system. So there's a whole other set of rules and practices underway in the river to control those nutrients and that kind of load, so that we have a cleaner system. We don't have as much algae and that kind of effect.
But the algae, not related to PCBs, but it's mostly due to the runoff, the
nutrients coming into the system from runoff, from point source discharges, from non-point source.
And so, I mean, are you guys working on any of that stuff, or is that separate work that somebody else is doing?
Well, besides my working on the Fox River PCB cleanup, my regular job before this all started happening was I'm a wastewater engineer, and I work with municipal and industrial wastewater treatment plants in Brown, Door, and Kewaunee County. So yeah, there's a lot of work, a lot of history with wastewater treatment plants, the De Pere treatment plant just downriver, and the Green Bay GBMSD treatment plant that's been around for a long time. So that's what I work with them. There's been a lot of effort, a lot of improvements in the function of those plants. So they're really doing a very good job at removing their load from the system. But right now, a lot of the load coming in the system is from non-point sources.
Runoff.
And so we're spending a lot of time working on that. Plus, still point source controls are being improved and are being tightened down. So all in all, the system should be getting cleaner, will be getting cleaner over time.
So you're a wastewater engineer who started work in late 70s, early 80s, is that?
81.
81. So that's kind of in the wake of various Clean Water Act and amendments, et cetera. So kind of an interesting time to be a wastewater person. What's different now than when you started?
Well,
Have these laws worked?
Yeah. Have what?
Have these laws worked?
Yeah, the Clean Water Act, I passed somewhere in 72-ish, I think, and then didn't really start getting fully implemented till the late 70s. And so then we saw the effect of that through rebuilding or upgrading of wastewater treatment systems in the late 70s, early 80s. And so, yeah, there's dramatic improvements at that point where a big part of the organic load was dramatically reduced. And so then we went through a period of 20, 30 years where we're just continuing on with developing that technology and developing that process, applying those rules to the various discharges. And so we were in pretty much of a steady state, other than the non-point source. That's a whole nother side, just the runoff kind of contaminants. But from a point source perspective, there's a lot of construction of wastewater treatment plants, rebuilding and such. Now we're in this phase where we're in kind of almost another major step in nutrient control and trying to get the nutrient loads in the system so that we don't have the algae problems that we do. So we're into a new stage right now of very much more increased control on the nutrients coming into the system.
And probably for around here, the economic landscape of northeastern Wisconsin has changed dramatically. You mentioned before that paper mills, there's fewer of those, but there's fewer heavy manufacturing in general, and probably, I mean, that's not necessarily a good thing in general, but it's probably a good thing for the environment around here, I would think.
Yeah, there's certainly much less industrial load going into the river, but those industries that are here have really done a good job and are producing extremely high quality effluent. So they've not only, there's been certainly a reduction in that overall load to the system, but there's also been a fairly significant improvement in the quality of the wastewater that they produce, and they've stuck a lot of money into their treatment processes and meeting the new rules. And now we're into this next round of controlling phosphorus more effectively so that we don't have trying to control the algal blooms that we have and limit the nutrients in the system, which are the most visible effects that you see in the system. When we're doing our remediation of the river for PCBs, you don't see PCBs per se. It just ends up in the fish, which then prevents us from eating them. But you don't see that visibly manifested in any visible way. What you see manifested is the nutrients.
And fresh water might be, I've heard it said, and you have too, I'm sure, the oil, the petroleum of the 21st and 22nd century. It's hard to imagine that a water system as big as the Great Lakes system, which this is part of, could be affected that much by the kinds of things that humans do, and in a fairly short period of time. Great Lakes have been around a while, much more so than the various plants, etc. You must have thought some about that. That we're sitting on maybe the Saudi Arabia of water here.
Well, that we are. Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
And I mean, are there things that we ought to be doing to raise awareness about that? I mean, is your sense that people really appreciate how scarce water resources are going to be in the future?
Well, I think people who live in this area don't think about that. We have so much water that it's something that just doesn't seem like a possibility. There are efforts underway to divert water from the Great Lakes elsewhere in the country, out west where they're short of water. And so there's, on a national level, it's a pretty big topic. But right here regionally, I think a lot of people are very well informed and understand that this is quite a resource. Quite frankly, I think that's why a lot of people are here, because you just don't find this in many other places in the country. And so I think people appreciate it, but they don't see it as a finite resource. And although there's a lot of water, there are lots of uses, lots of impacts on it. So our agency, EPA, our goal is to make sure that we're improving it and then preserving it so that we're not wasting it.
Right. I mean, we are going to leave to our children and grandchildren a much cleaner environment in general, certainly a cleaner river. We were talking before we started taping about how not that long ago the development along the river was facing away from the river because people didn't want to talk about it. And now riverfront property is the coolest thing to have around here because it is so beautiful. And you look back here, and on a day like today, who doesn't want to get in the boat and go up and down or go fishing, etc. So have you done any work with outside of the Green Bay area in other parts of the state?
I've pretty much spent my whole Department of Natural Resources career here. 32 years or so.
32 years. Wow. So what do you think that are the next projects that we ought to be tackling here once we get this cleaned up? Do we go further into the bay? Is that something that we need to do, or I mean, are the PCBs out there? Do we need to do that too?
Well, there are PCBs in the bay, but they're at concentrations that are so low that it's just really cost prohibitive to really go after them, because there's a lot of sediment in the river that we're remediating, but there's orders of magnitude more sediment out in the bay that are very low concentration, and it's not really cost effective to go after them. So we rely on kind of the natural dilution and degradation process to work. So there's really no plans to go out into the bay at this point in time, and so we're targeting the river.
So the solution to pollution is dilution?
That's a very, yeah, that is. I mean, we don't like that to be an answer, but it does work that way. And in fact, that's the way in the early years when the river was fully loaded, that's what they depended on, was dilution. Right now we have very advanced wastewater treatment plant that treats water down to conditions that are basically as good or better than the river in many cases. So we're looking for the river to improve to the point where they're the same. So we are not having that kind of impact.
It's sort of a monumental project to just get your arms around how clean is the river, how good is the water quality, especially because, I mean, was anybody even thinking about this stuff 50 or 60 years ago? Maybe they were just starting, right? When the Cuyahoga River was on fire back in the 50s or 60s. I mean, it's amazing how much progress has been made in really not that many years. Well,
I mean, nationally, the effort for clean water really, the big boom was the Clean Water Act in 1972. That's when it really started, and then it took some years for that to roll out and implement. So before that, I mean, there were water pollution control, water treatment plants and water pollution control efforts, but nothing near like what happened beginning in 1972 and thereafter. So,
I mean, as a country, we've invested uncountable billions of dollars in that. And I mean, it's not wasted money. I mean, it provided jobs, and how do you put a price tag on having a cleaner environment? I mean, as an economist, I mean, I have spent a lot of time thinking about that stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
But in the end, it really is about being able to use this the way that that our collective unconscious wants us to. I mean, as human beings, we look at the settlements of the world. They tend to be around where land meets water, or et cetera. And this is no different. When we think about Marquette and Joliet coming through here and meeting the natives that were here, they were here because of the water. Well, I usually ask this question as a wrap up to most of my guests. If somebody is interested in this, what do you recommend that they do in order, a young person that wants to get into this field? How do you recommend that they go about doing this?
Well, I came through it through the engineering education aspect of it. And so science, engineering are the two primary ways, engineering being the most advantageous. It gives you the most flexibility, but get into the sciences, heavy into the sciences, chemistry, physics, calculus, all that kind of stuff.
It's got to do math, huh?
Well, you got to do math, and you have to do some, and the biology part, there's a lot of biologists that work for the department also, so pretty heavy into that. But what I'm doing, I'm an engineer. I was required to be an engineer to be in this kind of role, and so I'd say if you want to get into that aspect of it, there's lots of neat areas in the biological side of it too, but this is more an engineering sort of effort than anything else.
It's a massive project, and you're getting federal funding, I'm sure, for some of this stuff. No federal funding, it's all local funding, huh?
Well, it's the responsible parties who are paying for the entire cleanup. So,
and some of those have been changed hands, so that'll keep the lawyers busy, I'm sure, for a very long time.
Yes, that would be for sure.
Well, thank you for joining us today. Until next time, I wish you great conversations from St. Norbert College.